Sabalenka's shocking reaction to what many perceived as Iga Swiatek's disrespectful gesture didn't stun fans because of confrontation or anger, but because of restraint, clarity, and what she refused to amplify, turning a small on-court moment into a revealing case study of modern women's tennis. The match already carried immense pressure, with two world-class champions facing each other, when Swiatek questioned a line call and asked the umpire to inspect the mark. A legal and common request that nonetheless stood out because it was uncharacteristic of her usually calm, composed demeanor, instantly igniting debate across social media and press rooms about intent, frustration, and respect. Yet no one anticipated Aryna Sabalenka's response, because instead of arguing, confronting, or escalating the moment, she chose silence and perspective, later explaining that she hadn't even seen the gesture live, and emphasizing that the sport itself mattered more than social drama, reminding everyone that women's tennis stands strong on its own merits without manufactured controversy. That calm, almost indifferent reaction became the real story, because in an era driven by outrage and instant reaction, silence itself became a statement, forcing fans, analysts, and commentators to reassess what respect, rivalry, and professionalism truly mean at the highest level. To understand why this moment resonated so deeply, context matters, as Sabalenka and Swiatek represent two contrasting philosophies within the sport, with Sabalenka embodying power, emotion, and transparency, her explosive serve and thunderous groundstrokes matched by visible passion and authenticity, while Swiatek represents control, precision, and emotional discipline, rarely allowing frustration to surface and letting performance speak louder than gestures. Creating a rivalry not defined by theatrics but by subtle battles of mindset, adjustment, and pressure management. This contrast magnified the moment, because a rare deviation from Swiatek's composure drew scrutiny, while Sabalenka's unexpected restraint challenged assumptions about her emotional style, shifting the narrative entirely. As clips circulated and debates intensified, Sabalenka's measured comments sparked widespread discussion, praised by some as maturity and professionalism, questioned by others as dismissive or quietly critical, revealing how women athletes are often held to heightened standards of emotional conduct compared to their male counterparts, where similar gestures frequently pass unnoticed. Analysts framed the incident not as a rules dispute, but as a reflection of broader issues in women's sports, including media amplification, gender expectations, and the pressure placed on elite players to balance performance with public perception. Beyond headlines, the moment highlighted how modern women's tennis is shaped as much by personality and philosophy as by rankings and trophies, with top players serving as ambassadors, role models, and cultural figures whose every action is magnified. Sabalenka's decision to focus on the bigger picture, team events, the integrity of the sport, and perspective over spectacle underscored her priorities and reinforced that professionalism doesn't always require engagement. Sometimes it requires restraint. Ultimately, this wasn't a story about disrespect, but about interpretation, perspective, and how champions navigate scrutiny under the brightest spotlight, reminding fans that in elite tennis, it's often not the points won or lost that define a moment, but the quiet human decisions made alongside competition. Sabalenka's response added depth to her rivalry with Swiatek, illustrating two different but equally valid approaches to pressure, one rooted in measured action, the other in controlled reaction, both commanding respect. And as women's tennis continues to evolve, moments like this reveal why the sport remains compelling, not because of manufactured drama, but because of the integrity, focus, and philosophy its champions bring to the court. Proving that true legacy is built not by reacting to every moment, but by maintaining clarity and principle when the world is watching most closely. And that clarity is exactly why this moment will be remembered long after the scoreline fades, because it exposed how elite competitors evolve not just in skill but in self-awareness, learning when to engage and when to let silence carry weight. For Sabalenka, it reinforced her growth from a player once defined by raw emotion into a champion who understands optics, legacy, and the responsibility that comes with being at the top. While for Swiatek, it served as a rare reminder that even the most composed athletes are human, capable of flashes that invite interpretation whether intended or not. Together, this exchange, so brief yet so dissected, became a mirror reflecting the pressures unique to women's tennis, where excellence is often judged through a double lens of performance and perception, and where every gesture can be magnified into narrative. Yet instead of fueling division, the aftermath subtly elevated the sport, sparking conversations about respect, fairness, and the unnecessary hunger for controversy in an era dominated by clicks and outrage. As the season moves forward and these two champions continue to collide on the biggest stages, this incident will linger not as a point of conflict, but as proof that rivalry doesn't require hostility, that greatness doesn't demand noise, and that sometimes the strongest statement an athlete can make is choosing the game over the drama, allowing tennis itself, pure, demanding, and unforgiving, to remain the center of attention where it belongs. And when you zoom out even further, this moment begins to feel less like an isolated incident and more like a snapshot of where women's tennis is headed. A sport increasingly defined by psychological strength, emotional intelligence, and the ability to navigate scrutiny without losing identity. Sabalenka's restraint wasn't passive, it was intentional, a signal that she understands the long game of legacy, where every reaction becomes part of a permanent record, and Swiatek's brief departure from her usual composure served as a reminder that dominance carries its own invisible weight, the constant expectation to be flawless both in play and presentation. The public reaction revealed just as much about the audience as it did about the players, exposing how quickly narratives are constructed and how rarely context is afforded in real time, especially to women at the top of their profession. Yet through the noise, what remained constant was the quality of tennis itself, the relentless precision, power, and adaptability that continues to push the women's game forward. As these rivalries deepen and new challengers emerge, moments like this will continue to test not just forehands and backhands, but patience, restraint, and perspective. And in that sense, this incident quietly reaffirmed why the current era of women's tennis is so compelling, because its champions aren't just winning matches, they're redefining what strength looks like under pressure, choosing principle over provocation, and proving that the sport's most meaningful statements are often made without saying a word. And that silent strength is precisely what separates fleeting champions from enduring ones, because trophies can be won in a season, but composure under scrutiny is forged over years of expectation, criticism, and relentless visibility. Sabalenka's response demonstrated an understanding that true authority doesn't need validation, that a player secure in her place doesn't chase narratives or correct every interpretation. She simply continues forward, letting consistency speak louder than confrontation. Swiatek, meanwhile, remains emblematic of a champion still carrying the burden of being the standard-bearer for precision and control, where even a momentary deviation becomes headline material, underscoring how narrow the margins are at the summit of the sport. This dynamic, more than any single gesture, captures the essence of elite women's tennis today, a landscape where physical dominance intersects with psychological endurance, and where the battle off the court can sometimes rival the one inside the lines. As fans and media eventually move on to the next controversy, this episode will settle into something quieter but more meaningful, a reference point for how rivalry can coexist with respect, how emotion can be managed without suppression, and how the game continues to evolve through the choices its greatest players make in moments that test more than their strokes. In the end, what lingers isn't debate or blame, but the recognition that the sport is in capable hands, guided by athletes who understand that legacy is built not only on winning, but on the wisdom to know when the best response is simply to play on. And playing on is exactly what defines this generation, because the modern women's game no longer pauses for validation or explanation. It moves forward with an understanding that excellence doesn't require permission or applause. Sabalenka's choice to disengage from the noise reflected a veteran awareness that headlines fade faster than habits, and that maintaining internal clarity matters more than winning external arguments, while Swiatek's continued dominance reminds us that even under microscopic scrutiny, the commitment to process remains unshaken. The incident, stripped of speculation, ultimately highlighted how rivalry at the highest level has matured, shifting away from overt confrontation and towards subtle psychological edges, where composure itself becomes a competitive advantage. As younger players watch these moments unfold, they're learning lessons that no practice session can teach: how to handle misinterpretation, how to protect focus, how to let performance answer questions others try to force. This is how eras are defined, not just by grand slam counts or rankings, but by the standards set in moments of pressure. And the current era is quietly establishing one built on resilience, restraint, and respect. When future champions look back, they won't remember the outrage cycles or the viral clips. They'll remember how the game kept evolving, how its leaders chose principle over provocation, and how women's tennis continued to assert itself not through noise, but through undeniable, sustained excellence that speaks long after the moment passes. And that sustained excellence is what ultimately reframes moments like this from controversy into context. Because when time creates distance, what once felt explosive settles into something instructive, revealing patterns about leadership, maturity, and the invisible responsibilities carried by elite athletes. Sabalenka's evolution becomes clearer when viewed through this lens, tracing a path from emotional volatility to controlled intensity, where passion is still present but now channeled with intention, allowing her to compete ferociously without being consumed by reaction, a balance that only arrives after years of learning how quickly narratives can spiral beyond truth. Swiatek's role, meanwhile, continues to highlight the paradox of dominance, where excellence invites not only admiration but constant scrutiny, turning even neutral actions into talking points simply because of who she is and what she represents, a reminder that sustained greatness often comes with an expectation of perfection that no human can fully maintain. Together, their interaction underscores a broader truth about women's tennis today, that the sport is no longer fighting for legitimacy or attention, but negotiating how that attention is framed and consumed in an age where immediacy often replaces understanding. The discourse that followed revealed how easily competition can be overshadowed by interpretation, and yet how resilient the game remains when its top figures refuse to let peripheral noise dictate their focus. As tournaments roll on and new storylines emerge, this episode quietly reinforces the idea that progress in sport isn't always marked by dramatic gestures or public statements, but by the steady normalization of professionalism, where restraint is no longer seen as weakness but as control, and silence is understood as confidence rather than avoidance. The next time these players meet, the tension won't be fueled by unresolved conflict, but by mutual awareness, by the knowledge that both have been tested not just by opponents, but by perception itself and emerged unchanged in purpose. That's what ultimately endures, the ability to absorb pressure without allowing it to redefine intent, to compete fiercely while preserving clarity, and to let the quality of the tennis remain the loudest voice in the room. In that sense, this wasn't a moment that fractured rivalry or respect. It was one that quietly deepened both, reminding everyone watching that the highest level of sport is as much about who you are under scrutiny as it is about how you perform under pressure, and that the most lasting statements are often made not in reaction, but in resolve, carried forward point by point, match by match, long after the noise has moved on. And as that resolve carries forward, it becomes increasingly clear that moments like this are the invisible threads stitching together an era defined by substance rather than spectacle, where the loudest evolution is happening beneath the surface, in how athletes choose to respond when the spotlight distorts reality. Sabalenka's calm wasn't a dismissal of rivalry, but an affirmation that competition doesn't need added hostility to feel meaningful, that intensity can live entirely within the lines, expressed through footwork, shot selection, and nerve rather than words. Swiatek's continued focus, unshaken by the aftermath, reinforced the same principle from the opposite direction. That champions don't linger in explanation, they return to repetition, discipline, and process, trusting that consistency will outlast controversy. What the public witnessed, even if unintentionally, was a masterclass in emotional economy, the ability to conserve mental energy for what actually influences outcomes, a skill as critical as any technical adjustment. This shift matters because it sets a precedent for the next generation, signaling that success at the highest level now requires fluency in pressure management, media literacy, and self-regulation, not just raw talent. As women's tennis continues to command global attention, these understated decisions shape its identity, steering it away from caricature and toward credibility, where athletes are seen not as reactive figures, but as thoughtful competitors navigating complex ecosystems. In hindsight, this episode will be less about what was questioned and more about what was demonstrated, a collective confidence in the sport's direction, a trust that excellence doesn't need constant defense, and a reminder that when the noise fades, what remains is the enduring rhythm of competition itself, steady, demanding, and resolutely focused on the next point. And that is where the story ultimately settles, not in the echo of debate, but in the quiet certainty that defines true champions. Because when the cameras moved on and the timelines refreshed, both players returned to the same place they always do, the baseline, the routine, the discipline that built their success long before a single gesture became news. Sabalenka's restraint stood as a subtle assertion of control, proof that strength doesn't always announce itself loudly, while Swiatek's unwavering commitment to process reaffirmed that composure is not the absence of emotion but the mastery of it. Together, they illustrated a truth that modern women's tennis continues to reinforce: that rivalry does not require animosity, that respect can coexist with intensity, and that the sport is strongest when its leading figures refuse to let fleeting moments overshadow lasting standards. In an era hungry for reaction, their responses offered perspective, reminding fans that greatness is measured not only by titles and rankings, but by the ability to stay anchored when the world demands noise. And so this moment, once framed as controversy, becomes something far more enduring, a reflection of maturity, evolution, and the quiet confidence of athletes who understand that the game does not belong to headlines, but to those who play it with clarity, purpose, and unwavering focus. In the end, the lesson is simple and profound. The most powerful statement a champion can make is not always spoken. Sometimes it is the decision to keep playing, keep improving, and let the tennis speak long after the conversation fades.